I have never been so touched. I have spoken in more churches, I suppose, than, I don't say this boastingly, but I expect I have spoken in more churches than has any minister in West Virginia. And I'm not a minister. I don't proclaim to be worthy of standing in this place. But I don't think I've ever been so touched as I have been today. There's most beautiful voices in that choir. Renee Chandler, that beautiful, trained voice. And every voice in that choir, it seemed to me as I listened to them, was a beautiful voice. They sang such as I've never heard. And for the first time I've seen the wind instruments in a choir. And I think that I've always been a little partial to the stringed instruments. But I'll have to say that those who played the instruments played them well. And the music blended in beautifully with the voices. And the way that you extend your fellowship, hospitality, and the warmth of your greeting is something that I will never forget. It's something that more churches ought to practice. I've been in all kinds of churches. I've been in cold churches, and I've been in warm churches. And believe me, I've never seen one that practiced Christian fellowship and the genuine warmth of fellowship that you have indicated here today. I'm grateful for the invitation to come. I express appreciation to Rod Taylor and also to your pastor. I've never seen so many pastors in any one church. But Oliver Hogue is undoubtedly a man of tremendous outreach and inspiration and energy. As I said, I'm not a minister, but every one of us is a testimony, a witness to something, good or bad, and some of us are witnesses to both. But each is a witness. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, and the people whom he hath chosen for his own inheritance. That verse captured ancient Israel's understanding of its own relation to God. But early in America's history, many of our forefathers began to find parallels between ancient Israel and America. Large numbers of early colonists came to these shores for religious freedom. They found here an abundant land inhabited by a savage people. And against almost impossible odds, they built towns and cities and won their independence from Britain. And as a result, most of our ancestors believed that America had a special covenant with God. For generations, that idea was an article of near faith for some. But in recent decades, others have tried to debunk the idea of America's providential destiny. They have attempted to secularize our history. America's rise was, they claim, just a matter of politics, economics, migration, and wars. But if one looks closely at our past, one sees clearly there the imprint of faith. Several New England colonies, as well as Pennsylvania and Maryland, were established primarily for religious reasons. Moreover, millions of settlers in other colonies and later immigrants, Baptists, Catholics, Jews, Lutherans, Quakers, for example, came to America for freedom of worship. And further, one of the most significant contributions of religious faith to America may have been the American Revolution itself. The majority of the founding fathers were churchmen who were steeped in the Judeo-Christian tradition. The God they worshipped was a provident and just magistrate who was himself indignant at the British tyranny. When Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, every colonel in command of the Continental troops except one was an elder in the Presbyterian Church. The Reverend Dr. John Witherspoon, a Presbyterian pastor and president of Princeton University, signed the Declaration of Independence, as did 9 of his former students from that church-related school. With the passing years, the influence of faith in our national life became even more apparent. In the 1830s, de Tocqueville, a famous French writer, traveled to America, and he toured this country. Here's what he wrote about America. On my arrival in the United States, the religious aspect of the country was the first thing that struck my attention. That was 150 years ago. De Tocqueville traveled up and down the land. He visited our farms, our businesses, our legislatures, and our schools. And finally he wrote, "There is no country in the world where the Christian religion retains a greater influence over the souls of men than in America." And that's not surprising. At times, the early colonists' lives seemed to hang only on a thread of faith. The Thanksgiving observances of the Plymouth colony and Thanksgivings called later during the Revolution were more than pious public gestures. In some of those precarious years, Providence alone explained America's survival. During the tumultuous Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin reminded his colleagues that throughout the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congresses opened with prayer. And so one day he stood before the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and he addressed the chair in which sat General George Washington. He said, "Sir, I have lived a long time. The longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see that God still governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without our Father's notice, is it possible that we can build an empire without our Father's aid?" He said, "I believe the sacred writings which say, except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it." And he said, "I move you, sir, that henceforth we begin our meetings with prayer, else we shall succeed no better than did the builders of Babel." And they did that. They followed Franklin's suggestion. And that request started a custom that never lapsed in Congress. Not only did that Constitutional Convention then begin to come together, where theretofore it had been filled with dissension and disputes, but to this day, the first daily order of business in the United States Senate and House of Representatives is a prayer led by a chaplain or some other person. And one of those some other persons is going to be your pastor. Mr. Oliver Hogue will be one of those other persons one day, soon. And those who are skeptical of such a practice might weigh Franklin's rationale for prayers in legislative assemblies. His call for prayer during the Constitutional Convention sometimes surprises some people. Anti-religious forces usually point to the First Amendment of the Constitution and claim that the Founding Fathers erected a wall of separation between church and state. Ironically, however, those anti-religious forces have misread the First Amendment and the Founding Fathers' intentions. The Bill of Rights says, quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion." But it doesn't end there. Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The framers of our Constitution were by and large deeply religious men. However, many of those men had suffered discrimination from established religions, from state churches. They wanted no established church. Instead, they wanted a free exercise of religion, with no preference given to this religion or to that religion, or to that denomination, rather. The wall that the Founding Fathers erected in the First Amendment was not a wall against religion. It was a wall against sectarianism. As the Founding Fathers intended, religion flourished in America. And for that reason, many people were disturbed by the Supreme Court ruling some years ago with reference to prayer in the public schools. And not surprisingly, restoring prayer in the public schools has become a major concern for many Americans and many West Virginians. And regardless of what you hear, I have long been interested in religion and in the schools, and I have supported legislation to permit voluntary school prayers. When I started school in a little two-room schoolhouse in Mercer County, along about 1922 or 3, we had prayer in the schoolroom every morning. We said the Lord's Prayer. Well, I'm not a minister. I like to pray silently. I don't feel that I have the words to pray openly. And I feel that if I pray openly, I'm thinking about the word that I use. And so we prayed openly in those days in the little two-room schoolhouse. I pray silently every night. And I believe we should have voluntary prayer in the schools. I think we could have a moment for silent prayer. Those who want to pray can pray in their own way. Those who don't want to pray need not pray. And for these reasons, I applaud President Reagan's recent call for a constitutional amendment permitting voluntary prayer in our public schools. Of course, such prayer should not impose or prescribe any specific religious formula. I have my own convictions. Each of you has your own convictions. Nobody's going to take that away from us. But school children who want to pray should not be denied their freedom of religion in the name of protecting somebody else's freedom from religion. So let those who wish to pray, pray. And let those who do not wish to pray follow their own wishes. But when you take whatever you take out of the schools today will be out of the nation in a generation. And whatever you put in the schools today will be in the nation within a generation. I believe our children deserve the opportunity to take a moment for spiritual reflection in their school day. Freedom to pray is a precious part of American heritage for all our citizens, including our children. Of course they could pray before they go to school. Of course they can pray after they get from school. But many children Many children in the homes of America today are never introduced to prayer. And so it is only in the schools that they might have that one moment of introduction to the thought of worshiping our Maker. And generation after generation, the religious impulse has multiplied across our country. On the frontiers, the circuit riders, apparently first launched by a Methodist bishop, Francis Asbury, rode into the wilderness to spread their faith. And they left books and pamphlets, newspapers, and a desire to civilize a harsh land. And in the process, the values cultivated by those early religious communities set national standards. And Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes remarked, "The 10 Commandments will not budge." The members of various religious faiths knew that and reared their sons and daughters in that understanding. In spite of primeval conditions, frontier violence, border warfare, drunkenness, outlawry, and ignorance, gradually the eternal yardsticks of those 10 Commandments and the Judeo-Christian tradition became the primary gauges of morality and law in our country. Our spiritual ancestors believed, moreover, in elementary virtues, sobriety, chastity, and thrift, for instance. They also viewed work as a noble activity. They valued honesty and demanded even of themselves a day's pay. And largely as a result, the goods they manufactured bore a quality that won the world's favor and captured the world's markets. Under the influence of such strong faith, it is not surprising that even the chief executive of our country should eventually carry an almost sacred aura. Indeed, most of the presidents of the United States have been committed Christians. 3 of them, in fact, had once planned on entering the ministry: James Madison, John Adams, and Benjamin Harrison. But of all the presidents, Abraham Lincoln is recognized as the most theologically astute and biblically influenced. Though he never formally joined a church, he attended church often. After his assassination, Lincoln earned a reverence usually reserved only for saints. Leo Tolstoy, the great 19th century Russian author, was so impressed with Lincoln's faith and virtue that he described him as a Christ in miniature. But Lincoln is not alone in his public witness of faith. Every president, from George Washington to Ronald Reagan, has included some reference to the deity in his inaugural address. And you can see it inscribed on the Senate chamber's walls. See it inscribed on the monuments and the statues and the buildings in Washington. Inscriptions from the Bible that remind us of that strong, unbroken thread of religious faith that has run from the beginning of our nation's history to today. And taken together, all of these things, all of these inaugural speeches, confirms the sense of divine purpose that runs throughout our history. Unfortunately, in the past quarter of a century, certain elements in America have mounted an anti-religious campaign across our country. As religious influences were squelched in our public life, as a so-called new morality was publicized on television, in movies, and in the record industry, And as drugs and immorality and perversion and infidelity were glamorized in popular culture, crime and murder and assaults and suicide rates have soared. Many people feared the dawn of a modern, moral, dark age in our country. But America is an ever-completed and ever-perfecting country, and God has an eternal role to play in the continued unfolding of American history. Not surprisingly, across our country today, there are new signs of a sincere religious stirring. Perhaps that stirring is a response to our confusing age. Perhaps that stirring is a response from men and women who are tired of living in a moral vacuum. But whatever its source, looking toward God is always an appropriate yearning. Abraham Lincoln would understand and applaud that yearning. He told a story of walking down a road one night with a friend. Suddenly there was a meteor shower which appeared in the clear sky above their heads. And though the meteors never reached Lincoln and his friend, the friend was nearly petrified with fear. Lincoln calmly advised his friend, "Do not look at the meteors. Keep your eyes on the stars beyond, and you'll be all right." And throughout our history, our ancestors looked beyond their anxieties and crises of the moment to the eternal light beyond. I grew up in the home of a coal miner, a man who could scarcely write his own name. I grew up in the home of a foster mother, my aunt, who I think was the hardest worker I've ever seen in my life. Deeply religious. I can't remember that she ever gave me a kiss in all the years. My mother died when I was 1 year old. But that woman who never gave me a kiss gave me something else. Many is the time I've seen her on her knees, praying. Whether I would come in home at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, driving down from the House of Representatives when I served there, she'd get up and open the door, fix me something to eat. And then when I went to bed, I would hear coming from the other room her prayers on her knees. And always when I started to leave, she would say, "Robert, you be a good boy." I was still a boy to her. "You be a good boy. I always pray for you." That was the kind of religious faith that made this a great country. She didn't have any degrees from colleges or high schools or junior high schools or elementary schools. She was tough, strong, hardworking, deeply religious. We used to live out in the country in Mercer County, 3 miles off what we called the hard road. Wasn't any electricity in the house, no running water in the house. We had an old organ, and on Sunday afternoons, I can still hear her singing. There is a fountain filled with blood, flown from Emmanuel's veins. And so they taught me how to live. And more than that, they taught me how to die. And so, throughout our history, people like those wonderful two persons have looked beyond their anxieties and their crises of the moment to the eternal light beyond. And from that source they have received guidance to steer and chart their course. And against that background, perhaps we can utter in our hearts the words of a great hymn that we share with our forefathers. Our fathers, God to thee, author of liberty, to thee we sing. And long may our land be bright with freedom's holy light. Protect us by thy might, great God, our King. Just a word in closing. I was also impressed today by your young people. The little people who came up and hugged me. And there's one sitting right here on the front row. And he said, "Would you tell President Reagan that I love him?" So I want him to give me his name and address before I leave here, because I want to send that down to President Reagan. I'm glad that you're bringing your young people to church, because the future rests with them. And to you wonderful grandparents, be sure you tell your grandchildren that you love them. Because the time may come when you can't. Now this lady would play Amazing Grace. I'd like to see if I could sing a verse or two of that.